So we found out via some discussions with Agriculture Canada that when they were trying to resolve their discussions with the province, and this was a kind of a 5-year journey, the first thing the federal government has to do is it has to offer any assets that it decommissions to its fellow departments. So when the PFRA pastures were devolved to the province, the Environment Canada and Ag Canada realized that there's a bit of a challenge with the 3 pastures here in the southwest. Governor Loch, Naslin, and Battle Creek are predominantly federally owned lands. There is some RM land, there was some private land, there is some provincial assets down there, but predominantly was federal land, and that's because those pastures back in the 1800s were the quarantine pastures for cattle coming up from Texas. Okay, so the cattle was quarantined there before it was dispersed to those who had purchased the cattle from the south. We had found out that to make that happen, to make the actual pastures in the southwest available to Environment Canada, they had to figure out a way to compensate the provincial government for its holdings, and at the same time, the other, I think it's 59 pastures if my math is right, that the province was going to inherit, they needed to figure out how do we get the federal corrals and the federal infrastructure and the federal lands in those pastures into our basket. So there was negotiations that occurred, and I'm not the expert, right, I mean, about that. I just know the discussion that was occurring, and they had to do assessments because you can't transfer federal assets, nor provincial, that I know of, without accountability. The public has a right to understand that they're getting full value for the investments that they made, right? Because there's the Accountability Act with federal, right? And there's the Access to Information Act. So people have the ability to inquire and have access to the actual numbers. Okay, so they did their assessments, voila, the numbers matched, and they're in the process of doing the swap. And again, I'm not the expert, I'm not in those rooms anymore. I was at one time, I'm not in those rooms. You'd have to talk to the province and the federal government in terms of where that's at. But in the meantime, we also did some work looking at mandate letters, and I don't want to bore you with this stuff, but the Prime Minister, and Doug can speak to this at the province, the Premier, every time they establish a cabinet, the Premier and the Prime Minister establish mandate letters for their ministers. And what it says in those mandate letters is what the Premier or the Prime Minister wants the minister, through his ministry or her ministry, to achieve. So at the federal level, the Prime Minister has stated emphatically in the mandate letters that he expects reconciliation that looks like reconciliation. So it's okay to say sorry, but we want to see in our departments actions that demonstrate that we're building new relationships with Indigenous people. So, you heard Tom. In the funding, there's not a funding program that I've reviewed that doesn't have an expectation for relationship or partnering with First Nations. I go back to my earlier statement, First Nations, they want to partner, but they don't have a lot of strong relationships with current people that can assist them in facilitating some of those things. So we said to Environment Canada, would this be an opportunity for us to discuss reconciliation and talk about Indigenous oversight? For me, it was interesting. I didn't realize that Cypress Hills is kind of like the Black Hills in South Dakota for the Sioux. That is Cypress for the Plains Cree. Okay? Both Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 view Cypress as a very important area. Treaty 6, many of the treaties were signed right there at Cypress Hills. They have reenactments. They just had a recent one at Fort Walsh a month ago to reenact the signing of Treaty 6. Okay? So for them, this was a place of spiritual importance. The Southwest is their traditional territory. But if you come to the Southwest, other than Nicolet, there isn't a lot of First Nations. And one of the reasons that occurred, and hopefully I'm not boring you with some history that you already know, but essentially our initial Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald, he referred to the Indian problem, and there wasn't going to be a First Nation tribe that would keep him from building a national railroad, right? So he wanted to ensure that there was no First Nations in and around where they had identified the CPR line initially. So that's why they were pushed to the north and to the east, okay? But for them, there's still history here. Some people still come to the Cypress Hills from Treaty 6 and Treaty 4 to meet relatives that were pushed to the south into the United States. So families were dispersed. So for them, it was not a place to come and buy, right, or own. It was to come and celebrate. So they viewed the big pastures down in the southwest here as an opportunity to maybe reacquaint, participate, and they needed a vehicle. So Environment Canada was interested. They set aside some funding, and we worked for about 18 months on a discussion around what could an Indigenous Management Oversight Partnership look like with Environment Canada, but also with those individuals who were going to participate in grazing activity on those, because the agreement, I think, with the province and the federal government was that the province was adamant that if they were transferring anything, that they're going to protect the interest of cattle producers that had used those pastures in the past. And the federal government agreed to that, and I don't know what the terms are. I've had a chance to look at the agreement, and it does talk about long-term opportunities for these cattle corporations to maintain grazing in those pastures. So we said there's a multiple of stakeholders, and there's not cattle producers, there's NGOs, there's academia, that's all interested in the Southwest, the preservation and the sustainability of prairie lands down here. So the Oversight Committee from the Indigenous side has to be porous and inclusive and transparent in terms of how it included them. Now, we signed the letter of agreement about a month ago. It's a letter of intent. The terms of reference for the committee is, or the Oversight Committee is still being ratified and developed, and likely there's going to be a tour of Indigenous chiefs down in the Southwest in the early fall. So again, the idea of the Oversight Committee is participation, and to provide Environment Canada and those people who participate in the development of a sustainable management plan the opportunity to engage in transparent conversation and open opportunity to communicate different perspectives, and hopefully for First Nations to demonstrate that there is cultural significance and historical significance to the Southwest area. So the excitement for me personally was that we set a venue now, a vehicle for conversations, legitimate conversations between the different interests, including the Indigenous interests. From that, some of you might have participated in the discussion because it's been going on for the better part of 8 or 9 months now. Parks Canada has a requirement to reinvigorate their strategic and operating plans for their parks every 10 years. Grasslands is this year, and we're invited into a conversation. And again, in their mandate letter for their minister, their call is for reconciliations to demonstrate Indigenous involvement. And so we've been discussing with them over the past couple of months the opportunities to have Indigenous oversight that would allow for another vehicle for conversations and Indigenous inclusion in the advancement of the Grasslands National Park in terms of what it wants to achieve over the next 10 years. And again, they've still got lots of room to expand, as I understand it. And most of you probably know this better than I, but it's willing buyer, willing seller approach. So they're really held hostage to somebody wanting to sell their land to the park. So they only move as fast as willing sellers allow them to move. But they do have a process in terms of how that works. And they're interested in having Indigenous participation, but again, they don't know what it looks like. And what I'm finding is, at the federal level, anyways, not so much at the provincial level, there's not a lot of people at the federal level that have their boots on this ground. There's a real centralization of the public service at the federal level, so it makes it harder. I know it's not impossible because we have digital connectivity, but it does make it harder to have a legitimate relationship develop when it's not face-to-face. And so, again, it's just an obstacle we'll have to address and overcome. Oh, and there is a tour this coming Monday. Several chiefs are coming down to tour the West Block and I think the East Block. Okay, so Environment Canada realized that it's got a bit of a deficit to achieve its 2020 Paris Accord. There's a Canadian shortfall. The number moves a bit, so I'm not going to recite the number. Somebody's here from Environment Canada, they can maybe recite the shortfall number, but in response to that, the federal government put up, I think it was $1.5 billion, and they dog-eared about $170 million for across Canada for what they're calling Indigenous protected areas, and the funding opportunity is really to encourage Indigenous groups to participate in project work that would enhance their ability to achieve their, enhance their numbers to achieve the target for 2020. As part of our conversations with Environment Canada and with the chiefs that I'm participating with, and Alvin Francis is one from Nikanit, Brad Swiftwolf, Chief Swiftwolf, is from Mooseman. Mooseman is a First Nation just north of North Battleford by Cochin, by Jackfish Lake. Right? A lot of people think Mooseman is the town. This is Mooseman First Nation. And Chief Tanya from Mosquito Grizzly Bear. Now, Chief Francis is Treaty 4. Chief Swiftwolf is Treaty 6, and Chief Tanya is Treaty 4 and Treaty 6. So there's representation there. Now, the idea is that they wanted to put together the proposal, but keep it open. And all these things are open to greater participation from other chiefs as they see fit for their First Nations to want to participate. So the proposal was this. Let's create an Indigenous Land Trust. Let's look at a $25 million proposal that would potentially achieve 25,000 acres in the southwest of Saskatchewan. This is all mystical, okay? It's not, I don't want anybody to think that the proposal has not been approved and the idea needs to be refined a little bit, right? Because it needs greater participation, but I'm giving you the concept. The challenge we faced is when we asked at the federal and provincial level, it was really the province that was pushing this, right? Is you can say you want Indigenous protected areas, but the first thing out of the province's mouth and First Nations is, what does that look like? What is that? And there's no answer yet. They're hoping through the funding that we'll figure this out. We'll figure out what the criteria is for an Indigenous protected area. And I'm not saying that there's people in Ottawa not working on it. There likely is, right? But it's emerging. Okay? It's not clear yet. So we said if the criteria isn't clear yet, then maybe we can help with this proposal and this project by bringing people who know what it could be together to work on it and again have another venue for collaboration and partnering with those people who can create a good definition of it. So one of the things we said is if the funding came through, we need to develop a relationship with cattle producers and others, right? To look at, so what does a sustainable land management and cattle production look like on an Indigenous protected area in the Southwest? And could we develop a common metric for the sustainable land management of those areas that would be globally recognized? Okay? And if we could do that, this leads to a greater opportunity for an Indigenous partnership with stock growers, cattle producers, agriculture producers of all sorts. There is cachet globally for an Indigenous brand, right? But nobody knows how they can secure that brand, okay? There's emerging technology. You're probably familiar with blockchain. It's digital recording. You can track it, right? But you can't track something that doesn't exist we have to create the metric that would demonstrate, so what's in an Indigenous brand if it's produced on an Indigenous protected area or other lands that want to participate. And you can only do that with people who have experience in doing that, and that's people in this room. It's people that aren't in this room that have insight, right, in terms of management of species at risk or protected habitat, cattle producers who have experienced what it takes to produce quality cattle on landscapes like this. It takes marketing people who understand the terms of marketing into the European markets or the Asian markets with this kind of brand. Now that's really up the road. We haven't got any funding, but we've been talking, and Tom has been a part of those conversations. What that's opened up for us is we have some projects that provide opportunity for segues for relationship building, and we're finding out Tom has opportunities, right, for SODCAP, and he's opening up the conversation with us, right, in terms of, would you like to partner with us on these projects? So again, it's a start, right? It's not a finish. The history, we can't go back and change it, but we can start today with new conversations, new relationships, new engagements that create opportunities for us to not walk, right, in different lanes, but maybe start to walk in similar lanes. And funny things happen when you have diverse opinions and diverse thought, right? Right? Okay? Insights occur, innovations occur, okay? And maybe there's new ways of prosperity, not only in terms of economic prosperity, but prosperity in terms of how we live together, right? And one of my colleagues, Gary LaPlante from Mooseman, says, wouldn't it be nice if we just learn how to be great neighbors in a great community, right? And that inspires me to continue working on these kinds of projects that encourage relationship building and working on opportunities that create prosperity for the whole. So I'll stop there.
I got a question on this TLE land, like